The Second Crusade was a bloody debacle. There's really just no other way to describe it. After the First Crusade, which established the four Crusader states, and the idea that this was the kind of expedition that could make reputations and earn spiritual benefit, those who answered the call of the Second Crusade found something quite different. To tell the story, I want to introduce you to one of the most remarkable women of medieval Europe. At a time when women were mostly seen and not heard, she had a decisive influence on the reign of not one, not two, but no less than 4 kings. She went on the Second Crusade in armor, and she had a front row seat to the third, which makes her one of the only major personalities to experience both of these episodes. She was the queen of both France and England at different times, and these were 2 rival countries. And she's also credited with having a decisive influence on reshaping courtly culture and the norms of chivalry, fostering an environment in which some of our most famous literary figures, such as Lancelot and Guinevere, could emerge into the popular imagination. Her name is Eleanor of Aquitaine, and she was one of the most influential people of her generation. And we'll be looking at the Second and Third Crusades through her eyes. You're listening to Villains and Virgins podcast, but before I get into all the fascinating details of today's story, I need to pause and say a special word of gratitude to the community of supporters on Patreon who make this podcast possible. And very special thanks goes to those list of people who are supporting this podcast at the highest level, and these include Richard Hubner, Charles Vigneron, Kenneth Jones, Tim Williams, Anthony Farnbach, Rick Kane, Gordon Carl, Agnes Weiner, Errol Silverstein, and Random FX. As a Patreon supporter, you get access to even more history content, including a special bonus episode related to today's story that's going to be available on Patreon for supporters only. And you also get access to live conversations about these historical episodes that I host online on a regular basis. So if you're interested in even more history, head on over to patreon.com/Eva Schubert and support the podcast there. Now back to our story. When I was looking for a way to tackle the Second and Third Crusades, I was trying to find a human angle. Because history is much more memorable when we look at it through personalities and individual lived experiences rather than just a list of dates and names and places and events. And Eleanor emerged as a natural thread to follow because she's present for both events and has a very strong influential role in how both of the Crusades turn out. She also switches sides at some point, so that allows to shift the angle from looking at it through the lens of the monarchs of France to looking at it from the perspective of England, and that's a pretty unique feature. Throughout her life, she remains next to the main players at all times, and is, of course, one of them herself. But who was Eleanor of Aquitaine, and where did she come from? Eleanor was born in the year 1124 in the Duchy of Aquitaine. And the medieval Duchy of Aquitaine occupies the southwest corner of what we now call France. It runs from the River Loire in the north to the Pyrenees Mountains at its southernmost extent. It borders northern Spain on its southernmost edge and reaches all the way to the city of Orléans in its northern corner. In many ways, Aquitaine partook of Mediterranean culture, although it didn't quite touch that sea. There was a thin strip of land that was another French duchy that separated Aquitaine from the Mediterranean coast proper, but it was very near neighbors. And in many ways, aspects of Mediterranean culture traveled over the Pyrenees Mountains and into Aquitaine. It was also famous for its wine production because it was fertile land, the weather was warm, essentially the southern France that we know today. And Aquitaine was famous for its culture as well. It was distinct from other parts of what we now call France. People who were members of Aquitanian court culture had a strong emphasis on manners, personal hygiene. There were items for cleaning nails, for example, and combs that were very commonly produced, and women in Aquitaine wore makeup and perfume. There was also an emphasis on rich fabrics. So velvet and velour are fabrics that were worn in Aquitaine and that in many ways they introduced to other parts of what is now France. So Eleanor is culturally distinct from a lot of the places she's going to spend her adult life because she grew up in this very particular part of France. Another one of the things that Aquitaine is famous for is its entertainment, especially its poetry and songs. And you could say that poetry and risk-taking ran in Eleanor's blood, all the way back to her grandfather, William IX, the Duke of Aquitaine. Now, William IX was a scandalous rogue. He had been on crusade very briefly, but things went extremely badly, and he wasn't known for his skill as a warrior. He's a notorious womanizer, and we know about this not just from contemporary reports, but from William's own hand, because he writes details of his love affairs down in the form of these incredibly sexually explicit songs that detail his adventures and misadventures. For this, he's known as the troubadour, a term that refers to song and poetry, which Aquitaine later became famous for, but William IX in many ways pioneered or popularized this form through these accounts of his own exploits. During the period of his second marriage, so he's already had a first wife, she retired to a convent. He's on his second wife, her name is Philippa, and he goes off on the First Crusade. It doesn't go very well. He comes back kind of in disgrace. There's been a lot of financial outlay, which has now been lost. They didn't come back victorious with glorious reputations, so he's kind of on a low. And he decides to take up with the wife of one of his vassals. So when we talk about vassals and feudal lords, you have to understand that if William is the Duke of Aquitaine, it means he's the highest ranking noble in that region. He owes his allegiance to the King of France, but within the Duchy of Aquitaine, he's the highest ranking guy. There are other nobles under him. They all swear their allegiance to him. They are his vassals. So it's one of these guys whose loyalty William IX actually needs that he decides to offend by having an affair with the guy's wife. And he does this so dramatically. The report is that he actually kidnaps this woman from her bedroom and carries her off to his own fortress. Her name, amusingly, is Dangereuse, which to us sounds like dangerous, but in the vernacular of the time meant hard to get. So William is still married, remember, and his wife isn't particularly keen on any of this, but there's not a whole lot she can do about it. He's already been excommunicated by the church, so the ability of the church to threaten or coerce him into renouncing his sinful ways and getting back on the path to being a respectable nobleman isn't really working very well. Philip carries on with this woman for a number of years, and he's very, very public about this. So his second wife retires to a convent. William is now living in sin, as it were, with his vassal's wife, which is kind of a dangerous thing to do because this is going to, for sure, instigate some pretty strong feelings of anger and perhaps a desire for revenge. So at some point, William tries to patch things over with the family of his mistress, Dangereuse. And his amazing scheme goes like this. Let's take my son, the son of William IX and his second wife, Philippa, and marry her to the daughter of Dangereuse, which Dangereuse had had with her husband before William IX got involved with her. So basically, let's take my mistress's child and my child from my marriage and marry them. So they're essentially a stepbrother and a stepsister, although William IX and Dangereuse aren't married, but they're going to marry their respective children to each other. And the first child of this marriage is a girl, and her name is Eleanor. So this is the family history. It's a history of scandal. It's a history of sexual incontinence, if you will, something that a number of people at the time would have taken a very dim view of. And it's something that is going to follow Eleanor around in her adult life. Some people will whisper that she came from a bad seed, that she carries within her the blood of William the Ninth, and that this bodes not well. But that is later in the story, after young Eleanor has acquired some enemies. Let's not skip too far ahead. So Eleanor wasn't the only child of this somewhat scandalous and very French marriage. She was just the first. She had a sister and a brother, but her brother died very early in his life, and Eleanor herself is still in her teens when her father becomes quite ill. So William the Ninth, her grandfather, is dead. Her father, William the Tenth, is now the Duke of Aquitaine, and he had gone off on a pilgrimage to Spain, that very famous Spanish pilgrimage, the Camino de Santiago, which we've talked about at another point on this podcast. So the Duke of Aquitaine goes off on this pilgrimage, he becomes extremely ill, and he realizes that he's probably not going to make it. So he has to quickly make arrangements for where his land is going to go and how his children are going to be taken care of. And what he does is he puts his daughter in the keeping of the King of France, who is his feudal overlord. And he says, the King of France is going to be the guardian of my daughter, and he's not allowed to absorb Aquitaine just automatically into his own territory, but he will be in charge of choosing a mate or choosing a husband for my daughter. That's what guardianship would allow him to do. So having made these arrangements, the Duke of Aquitaine dies. So the King of France at this time is a man that history remembers as Louis the Fat. And when I'm talking about France, I'm doing it for convenient reference so you know where roughly on the map this is, but it's not the modern nation-state of France as we know it today. It's largely in the same place if you look at it on the map, but it was divided into a bunch of little kingdoms, duchies, and counties, each of them in the keeping of a particular nobleman or noble family. So you could have, for example, Burgundy, or Bordeaux, and Aquitaine, and Normandy. These are all the different regions. The King of France has his own section of land, which is directly under his control, but the rest of the kingdom, including places like Aquitaine, is under the control of different nobles who owe the king their allegiance, so they are his vassals. Louis the Fat's own section of land is fairly large, but it's about the size of Aquitaine. Aquitaine is the only section of this kingdom that is as large as the land that is held directly by the king. And so he knows that if he can somehow acquire this land, he's basically doubled the amount of territory that's under his direct control. He has a strong incentive to do this, but the details of the will don't allow him to just absorb it directly, so he comes up with a brilliant plan. King Louis the Fat decides that he will marry Eleanor of Aquitaine to his own son, also called Louis. We'll call him Louis the Younger. And in this way, the child of that marriage will inherit the double kingdom. All the lands that currently belong to the kings of France, as well as the entire Duchy of Aquitaine, which is about the same size. As long as Eleanor produces a son, then this is going to greatly increase the strength of the kings of France. So King Louis the Fat's son, Prince Louis, Louis the Younger, is actually his second son, which means that like many other second sons amongst noble families in the Middle Ages, he had been training for a career in the church. It was usually the oldest son that would inherit the land and the noble titles of the father, and so Prince Louis's older brother was the one who'd been prepared for this. But when Prince Louis was only about 10 years old, his older brother suddenly died, and that led to a radical shift in Prince Louis's career plans. No longer was he being groomed for a position as archbishop or abbot. Now he was going to have to be prepared to be the King of France. At the time that his father is making this arrangement to acquire Aquitaine and decide Prince Louis's marriage, He's a very young man, about 17 years old. And you have to sympathize with this young man and imagine that he must have felt a little bit of confusion. For the first half of his life, he'd been preparing for a celibate life in a monastery, and now in his late teens, he's going to be wearing a crown and about to marry a wife. Those are a lot of adjustments to make, and there's some evidence that Prince Louis never quite recovered from his initial orientation towards living the life of a monk, but more on that later. Young Louis is 17, and he gets this news that he's going to be taking an armed party of very high-ranking knights and noblemen into Aquitaine to speedily marry the young Duchess Eleanor. Eleanor is at this time 15 years old, which by modern standards seems extremely young to be getting married, but in the Middle Ages it wasn't uncommon at all. And there was a very strong need for haste, because Eleanor had inherited such a large, fertile, and rich duchy that she was going to be the premier marriage prize for every ambitious noble within riding distance. And King Louis the Fat was very worried that some other baron or noble closer to Aquitaine was going to rush in, grab Eleanor, forcibly marry her, and thereby acquire those lands for himself. King Louis the Fat was quite worried that some other ambitious baron or nobleman closer to Aquitaine was going to rush in, seize Eleanor, marry her by force, and thereby acquire those lands as his own property. So there was a strong sense of urgency for getting young Prince Louis and this armed marriage party on the road to secure this important wedding as quickly as possible. These two teenagers are married in Aquitaine in the summer of 1137. And on their way back, heading back to Paris, which was even then the capital of King Louis's domains, they receive word that King Louis the Fat has died. It wasn't a great surprise. The king's health had been extremely poor even while he was arranging this marriage, but he passed away before his son even returned. Which means that these two teenagers are not just freshly married, they're also arriving in Paris as the new king and queen of France. I have been referring to Louis as the King of France for ease of reference, but I just want to point out that at this point, King Louis and his people would probably have called themselves Franks. In fact, both Louis and Eleanor claimed to be able to trace their family lines all the way back to Charlemagne himself, who had established the Empire of the Franks back in the 800s. And we've done a little bit of talking about the Empire of the Franks here on Villains and Virgins podcast, so if you're more interested in that, you can check out that series. But briefly, the descendants of Charlemagne roughly separated over time, and the eastern part of the Frankish Empire eventually became Germany. So the kingdom of the Franks divided over time, and the eastern half evolved into Germany and Germans, and the western half of the Frankish Empire evolved into France and the French. But both sides of that empire were initially identified as Franks, just as Charlemagne himself was. So we're going to talk about them as the King and Queen of France, but when they're going on crusade and when we look at them as they're discussed in the sources at the time, they're often called the Franks. Now, obviously, noble marriages were made for political reasons, and the personal feelings of the individuals involved had very little bearing on what was going to happen. And this was the case with Louis and Eleanor as well. They both accepted the fact that they had to make this alliance. It was good for both of their houses. This was their destiny. But there was some pretty strong evidence that in terms of temperament and character, they were quite mismatched. And again, this wasn't uncommon, but it's going to have very strong consequences in this particular case. There's evidence that young Louis found his wife very attractive. In fact, everything we hear about Eleanor suggests that she was beautiful, that she was charming, cultured, vivacious, high-spirited. Not boring, not a wallflower, the sort of woman who attracted attention everywhere she went. And Louis was not immune to her charms. He's even criticized by some of his contemporaries for his childish or far too strong cherishing of his wife. So he's inordinately fond of her, if you like. But young Louis also retained an intensely monkish sensibility from his early life, being trained as a churchman. And even now, as a 17-year-old, he's still under the training of an abbot, someone who's in charge of a monastery, a higher-ranking churchman. His closest mentor is a man of the church. And so his character and his habits and his disposition has been strongly inflected by this monastic background. And even as Louis becomes older and he gets farther into his adult life, he still enjoys eating with the monks in the monastery and joining in their processions. So it's a sensibility that he never lost. Eleanor, for her part, was less impressed with her husband. Even as a teenager, she didn't have the disposition to sit quietly and mind her needlework. And why should she? She wasn't just the daughter of a noble family. She was the duchess who had inherited a domain as large as that of the King of France. She was an important person in her own right. And the young queen was anything but ascetic in her habits, raised as she had been in the pleasure-loving, lively courts of Aquitaine, where good food and beautiful fabrics and lovely songs were standard expectations. Plain garb, plain food, and asceticism was really not Eleanor's style at all. Now, one of the most prominent churchmen of the time encounters the teenaged Eleanor of Aquitaine in her new role as Queen of France. And the impression she makes on him is not really a positive one. In fact, there's good evidence that his notes on the appearance that she had were used as the basis for a criticism of the habits of noblewomen that he then addresses to nuns in terms of a contrast of what noblewomen are like, which is bad, and how nuns ought to dress and comport themselves by contrast. In the words of Bernard of Clairveaux, the garments of court ladies are fashioned from the finest tissues of wool or silk. A costly fur between two layers of rich stuffs forms the lining and border of their cloaks. Their arms are loaded with bracelets. From their ears hang pendants enshrining precious stones. For headdress, they have a kerchief of fine linen, which they drape about their neck and shoulders, allowing one corner to fall over the left arm. This is their wimple, ordinarily fastened to their brows by a chaplet, a fillet, or a circle of wrought gold. Gotten up this way, they walk with mincing steps, their necks thrust forward, furnished and adorned as only temples should be. Some you see who are not so much adorned as loaded down with gold, silver, and precious stones, and indeed with everything that pertains. Gotten up in this way, they walk with mincing steps, their necks thrust forward, furnished and adorned as only temples should be. They drag after them a tail of precious stuff that raises a cloud of dust. Some you see who are not so much adorned as loaded down with gold, silver, and precious stones, and indeed with everything that pertains to queenly splendor." Unquote. Now, while Bernard intended this as a condemnation, I must thank him for the very detailed description of exactly what medieval ladies of fashion in the court of France were wearing, and Eleanor in particular, because this reference to gold and jewels and precious stones must be directed to her. After all, none of her ladies would dare to try and outshine the queen with the amount of jewelry on display, so the person who epitomizes this description must be Eleanor herself. So you can see that she was a glittering spectacle, absolutely covered in jewelry, in these fine fabrics, and his reference to a tail that drags in the dust is a clear description of the fishtail or train, a long strip of fabric that descends at the back of a dress or garment and trails behind the wearer as she walks. And that in itself is a statement of luxury because these fabrics are expensive, right? So to use even more of the fabric than you need to cover the body, to have additional lengths of fabric trailing along behind you, is a statement of conspicuous consumption. It's a way of saying, I have enough money to buy so much of this fabric that I can afford to have it trailing behind me. Which, of course, is a beautiful visual effect, but it's also a very expensive one. Now, I want you to keep Bernard of Clairveaux in mind. For those of you who've listened to the two-part series on the Templars, you will have encountered him in episode 1, because he was commissioned to come up with a rule governing the lives of the Templars when their order was founded. And you might also remember that he paid some attention to fashion. Generally, if it was fashionable, he had words of condemnation to say about it. And most memorably for me, he condemned shoes with pointed upturned toes, which were also fashionable at this point in the 1100s. And this is because Bernard of Clairveaux is perhaps an extreme version of an ascetic. So he becomes the abbot of the Cistercian monastery at Clairvaux, which is in France. And the Cistercians were an order that were founded because the existing monastic orders, which followed the Benedictine rule, there were Benedictine monks and nuns, were viewed as having gone soft. They were living lives that were too comfortable in their monasteries and nunneries. They were eating too much good food. They were wearing comfortable clothes. They weren't really experiencing an arduous, challenging, and painful existence. And the Cistercians wanted to change that. So Bernard was drawn to this as a young man. He chooses to become a Cistercian, and he becomes the ultimate Cistercian. And in many ways, he single-handedly oversees the rapid expansion of this new reformed version of monastic life. In his lifetime, he personally founds about 70 Cistercian monasteries and nunneries. So he has a major role in propagating and expanding this reformed version of monastic life. And in many ways, it's quite extreme. Some of the monks under his rule are actually falling down out of exhaustion. Their bodies can't sustain the rigors of what Bernard's version entails. And so he actually has to loosen the reins a little bit and soften up some of the rigors he expects others to follow. But Bernard himself doesn't soften any of the requirements on himself. He has such a strong role against ornamentation and luxury and art. He wants everything to be simple, plain, and austere. And he had an enormous role, not just in his own lifetime for reshaping monastic life, but even centuries later. There were some Protestant reformers like John Calvin, who lived 4 centuries after Bernard, who looks back on Bernard with great admiration and respect. And if you remember anything about the John Calvin episode in our series on the Protestant Reformation, you might be able to guess why. Because the version of Christian life that John Calvin was in charge of organizing in Geneva was also strictly regulated in terms of how you could do your hair and what colors you were allowed to wear and what pastimes you could have. Calvin, too, had this very strict, very austere, and very joyless version of what Christianity should be. And so he looked at Bernard of Clairveaux as a kindred spirit. Bernard plays a major role in our story, and we're going to see him again. But I just want to give you a little sketch of him right now, and I want you to keep him in your mind because he's going to pop up soon. So the royal couple, Louis and Eleanor, are certainly a mismatch in their dispositions and their appearance, but matters are going to get a whole lot worse. And the beginning of that spiral happens with a quarrel that the king gets involved in. King Louis was still a very young man, only about 22 years old, in the year 1142, when he gets into a quarrel with one of his vassals, the Count of Champagne. So Champagne, again, is one of these little kingdoms or domains inside France, and the Count of Champagne is the highest-ranking noble over the domain of Champagne. He owes his allegiance to King Louis as his overlord, but he's the count over his own domain within France. And Louis was angry with him because the Count had sheltered people that were a problem for King Louis. King Louis had gotten into a couple of quarrels with the church. One of them was over the decision about who got to choose bishops for certain parts in France, and Louis wanted to do it himself, and the Pope said, mind your own business. And the other quarrel had to do with a fairly scandalous marriage for Queen Eleanor's younger sister. Basically, Eleanor's sister married a man who was already married, another French noble. And the idea was that that nobleman should be able to annul his first marriage or put away his first wife and then marry the queen's sister. And again, the church wasn't a fan of this, and the Count of Champagne took the side of the wronged husband on this as well. So this count, in a couple of instances, had supported people who were problems for King Louis. And King Louis, a very young man, 22 years old, decides that he needs to go and teach the Count of Champagne a lesson. He needs to take this nobleman down a few pegs. How dare he take a defiant and open stance against the king and support people who were causing problems for the king? At least that's how the king saw it. You and I might say that the king was causing his own problems, but that's another perspective. From Louis's point of view, the Count was siding with people who were thorns in his side, and so the Count needed to be taught a lesson. So King Louis rides personally at the head of an army going into the domain of the Count of Champagne. And he's going to attack a number of towns and places, and one of them is the town of Vitri. And we're going to talk about this particular town because it's at this moment that an incident happens that is going to haunt Louis for the rest of his life. So his army enters Vitry and they set about sacking the town and burning it. So basically you need to imagine soldiers running around, grabbing whatever is of value, burning barns, burning houses, perhaps damaging fields. And the whole point of this is to cause the maximum amount of destruction. And of course there's violence. I mean, anyone who dared to resist could expect to be beaten or killed. And so you have terrified farmers and their wives and their children running, trying to get out of the way, running out of buildings that are burning, trying to get out of harm's way. This practice that the soldiers are engaged in at this moment is called harrowing in the Middle Ages. And you might have heard about William the Conqueror harrowing the north, for example, in England. Same idea. It's to go in and maximize the devastation that you can cause. And the point of this is punishment. Now you might be asking, what did the people of Vitry do to King Louis? Why are they being punished? Well, this is the Middle Ages, and the people of Vitry are in the domain of the Count of Champagne, which means they are under his protection. He is their overlord. So by attacking these people, first of all, the king is demonstrating that their overlord is not able to protect them, number one. But more significantly, it's an economic strike, because any nobleman who rules over this domain needs to collect taxes from the peasants or serfs working on his land. That's where he gets his wealth. That's his income. And so if you're going to burn fields and cause animals to scatter, this town is not going to be revenue producing this season. And that is an economic hit to the noble in charge of it. Of course, it's absolute devastation and even starvation for the people of the town, but they're little people, and in the games of kings and vassals, they don't count for much. Now, in the chaos of Louis's army cutting through this town, burning things up, smashing things, scattering animals, the terrified inhabitants run toward the church. And they do this because, by tradition, church buildings and church property were supposed to be shelters from violence. So they were seeking sanctuary inside the church itself, hoping that at least there their bodies would be safe, even while their fields and animals were being destroyed around them. At this point, something awful happens. Various accounts I've read have different versions of this, but what we know for certain is that the church catches on fire. Now, it might be because the buildings around it were burning and the flames jumped from the roofs of other houses to the church itself. Or it might be because some of King Louis's soldiers, drunk on destruction, set the church alight deliberately. Whatever the truth of the matter is, we know that King Louis was sitting on his horse and he saw the church go up in flames. And it was quite a spectacular blaze because the roof actually caved in and there were more than 1,000 people trapped inside. Men, women, and children. And so Louis, sitting on his horse, can see the smoke, he can see the fire, and he must have been able to hear the screaming. The terrible death toll of this catastrophe was not what Louis had intended. And he saw this disaster as a sign of divine judgment being visited on him. And remember, by the standards of the Middle Ages, Louis is a very pious guy. So burning churches is not on his to-do list. This is a bad thing to do by any measure, and willfully wiping out the entire population of a town, this wasn't something he'd planned on either. And so Louis, even though he carries on with his campaign of harrowing, and presumably gave instructions to stay away from churches when you're running around with torches, he continues the campaign for a while longer, but gradually he sinks into this very black depression. And he views himself as culpable, which he is, for this massacre, for this awful deed, and he's haunted by it. By the time Louis finishes this campaign, he's already in trouble with the church for other reasons, those quarrels we talked about earlier, and the Pope has cut him off from access to the sacraments, from confession, from all these daily rituals of faith that put the believer in contact with the church. And Louis feels this very keenly because he's devout, he's a believer. And so he trembles with fear for his soul at this penalty, and so he's motivated to get right with the church, to repent of the positions he's taken in his quarrels with the institutional church that have angered the Pope. So he does that, he reconciles himself, but he's haunted by the idea that he's been unable to atone for this awful incident at Vitri. He's stopped doing bad things and he's started to do the things that are expected from him, but the concept of repentance in the Middle Ages means penitence. It means if you've done something bad, then you have to undertake some action to demonstrate your repentance. And it needs to be a difficult, costly, or painful action to show your repentance. And so Louis is in search of a suitable penance to perform to sort of salve his soul from the black mark of the massacre at Vitri. Now, the idea of going on pilgrimage was a standard answer in the Middle Ages to this kind of question. Not only common people, but kings and nobles as well, very regularly went on these pilgrimages. And these were long, difficult, dangerous journeys that were undertaken as acts of faith. And the idea was the difficulty of the journey itself, the privations that you would endure, the comforts that you would be leaving behind for months at a time as you journeyed, weary and footsore and blistered and sunburned, toward your destination were part of the process of cleansing your soul. And if you got to the destination, which was typically the bones of a saint or some holy shrine, the visitation of that place would allow you to partake of spiritual benefit as well. And so there are many examples of people undertaking these sorts of pilgrimage journeys to atone for serious crimes, including murder. And we've talked about this in another episode on the Camino de Santiago pilgrimage. So if you want to know more about customs around pilgrimage and repentance in the Middle Ages, go check that out. But for King Louis, this is in the air. This is in the culture. So if he's looking for a way to repent, pilgrimage is sort of a logical place to go next. The king was already in this state of mind when, in the early days of 1145, word came from Jerusalem. So remember, after the First Crusade, which wraps up around 1099, 1100, there's a last wave that finishes in 1101, there are 4 Crusader states that have been established. So these are territories that are held by Western military power, but they're located all the way out in the Near East. And they're surrounded by fairly hostile neighbors. They're constantly at risk of being overrun. And so the word that comes in the early days of 1145 is that the Crusader state of Edessa has been captured and taken by Muslim forces. The Christian population has been killed or sold into slavery. It's now in Muslim hands. This is a terrible thing. But even worse is that Edessa being in Muslim hands now exposes the other three Crusader states to a much higher risk of conquest as well. So potentially, the entire labor of the First Crusade is now in danger of being undone. And so this is an urgent call that comes from Jerusalem for military aid, and not just a little bit, a massive army on the scale of the First Crusade. This is what they're asking for. King Louis seizes on this opportunity immediately. After all, in the Middle Ages, the idea of a crusade was basically an armed pilgrimage. That means that all the spiritual benefits and the hardship and the difficulty that was attached to regular pilgrimage was entailed on crusade, but you also had to deal with combat and the risk of being actually killed by facing an enemy army. So King Louis realizes that everything he was looking for in pilgrimage already, by way of difficulty and repentance, is now contained in this opportunity. And like other pilgrimages, the crusade promises forgiveness for your sins. And if you die on crusade, just like dying on pilgrimage, the belief was that you went straight to heaven. So King Louis believes that the road to redemption has suddenly been revealed to him, and this is God's message, that the crusade is what he needs to undertake. Now, there were other reasons for the monarchs of France to want to be involved in this. One of the Crusader states now at risk, the state of Antioch, was actually ruled by none other than Eleanor's uncle. So someone who's now closely related by marriage to the French royal family. And so going and providing aid in this case, in what is going to become the Second Crusade, will be offering assistance to near kin. The Pope, who also hears this call from Jerusalem, was then embroiled in quite a lot of turmoil and infighting within the church itself and with different factions in Europe. He has a weak position, this particular Pope. He's not even able to occupy Rome at this point. And so he sees the crusade as a potentially unifying force in Christendom, some larger, nobler cause that can reunite all these sort of contending factions and give a sense of purpose and unity. So he wants to sign on to this. He's going to support the call for crusade. And he's also very much influenced by Bernard of Clairveaux. Here he is again, because Bernard of Clairveaux was his mentor. And this may seem odd. You may say, well, isn't the Pope the highest spiritual authority? Why is the Pope going to Bernard of Clairveaux? Bernard of Clairveaux had been a powerhouse in building the church for decades now. And this particular Pope was a fairly recent arrival. He didn't have the kind of long, glorious career that Bernard had, and he had followed Bernard's teachings as a Cistercian. So he views Bernard as kind of a spiritual mentor. And Bernard views himself as the Pope's spiritual mentor as well. He actually writes letters admonishing this Pope not to get too large a head when he's made Pope, to view himself with humility. So you see Bernard admonishing the Pope. This is not just in the Pope's head that Bernard has higher status. Bernard is kind of convinced of this too, in spiritual terms, of course, only. So the Pope, unsurprisingly, appoints Bernard of Clairveaux as the official preacher of the crusade, the one who's going to go out and be in charge of bringing the message across Europe to get them to answer the call of Jerusalem. And while, of course, having the Pope's authority for the crusade is important, it's going to be the charismatic voice of Bernard himself that will have the decisive effect, as you're about to see. So King Louis pitches this idea publicly at his Christmas court in 1145. Now you might be thinking, wait a second, didn't the call from Jerusalem come in the early days of 1145? And Christmas of 1145 is near the end of the year? I mean, this has got to be like months going on in between this urgent call, and now the King of France is sort of formally pitching the idea to his vassals. This is the Middle Ages. Things move slowly. Things take months or even a year to organize, And a crusade is not a picnic. It is a very, very major undertaking. So we know that Louis pitches this idea to his court, his barons, his dukes, his counts, his vassals. These are nobles whose support he requires. He can't just go off on a crusade without them or without their approval. So they need to be persuaded. And the evidence we have from this gathering at Christmas doesn't suggest they were particularly enthusiastic. The king himself made a speech promoting this idea, and some historians think that perhaps he leaned too heavily on his own personal motivation of redemption and cleansing his soul from its spots. And you can understand why some of the barons and counts were sitting there listening dubiously, because the fact that the king has a dirty conscience and feels the need to cleanse it is fine and well for him, but it's not a great reason for everyone else to undertake the massive expense, not to mention the physical risks and hardship of going on a military expedition that's going to last probably a couple of years. This is a major undertaking. And so the nobles sat and they listened to Louis, but apart from a couple of bishops who were in the court, there was no vocal approval or agreement that was expressed. So far, King Louis is not getting the support that he's going to need. And for this reason, there was another meeting that was called in the early months of 1146, so just a few months after Christmas. And this gave the king and the queen time to work on individual nobles in the interim. And we know that Eleanor of Aquitaine in particular went around and talked to men who held land inside her domain of Aquitaine. And she appealed to them personally. She sort of piqued their egos and promised them glory and said, are you too chicken to go? I mean, we don't have her exact words, but through various methods of persuasion, cajoling, and prodding, she's managed to go behind the scenes and increase the support for this idea, at least among the nobles in Aquitaine, which was a large chunk of the kingdom. And the king did similar things, perhaps with less success. But the idea was that by gathering all of these important nobles again, in 1146, they were now going to bring a new factor in. Here, the nobles would hear the words of the Pope, the official call for crusade, and they were going to hear it from the charismatic lips of Bernard of Clairveaux himself. It's difficult to adequately explain what a charismatic figure Bernard was. I've already said that he had greater moral authority than the Pope in many ways. And this is because he'd built a reputation decades long for being utterly committed, body and soul, to asceticism, to piety, to devotion. And he was a prolific writer. We have many, many, many examples of things that Bernard wrote, letters he wrote to kings and nobles and popes. We have instructions he wrote, various rules and admonitions to monastic communities. He was this extremely active figure who had an enormous effect, far outsized what you would expect any particular individual to have. So he is the most prominent churchman of his age. There's nobody who outshines him. So he's a very high-profile figure and profoundly respected. And this is in many ways not because he came from a noble family, although he did, or had a lot of wealth. It was because of the personal piety that was on full display for everybody. It was the sort of thing you couldn't fake. So Bernard believed in asceticism, and it wasn't just a belief. For example, he lived in basically a cupboard, a tiny little space, not even a room, that was under the staircase of his monastery at Clairvaux. And remember, he's the abbot. He's the boss, the highest-ranking monk in that institution and one of the highest-ranking churchmen anywhere. If you have your boss living in a cupboard under the stairs, his personal commitment to hardship and asceticism is kind of beyond question, because he could easily have had the largest and most comfortable room. It would have been expected, perhaps, that that's what he would occupy. But Bernard leads by example. When he says all of you should be ascetic, He's also saying, let's see how many of you can be as ascetic as I am. I'm going to lead by example here. And he did the same thing with his food intake. He fasted so hard and so frequently that he gave himself extreme gastrointestinal problems. And we know this because he actually had to have a designated space in his monastery where he could be sick, where he could vomit during church services. That's how severe his gastric problems were as a result of abusing his digestive system and his health over decades. So Bernard embraces this suffering, this self-caused suffering, and everyone can see it in his body. He's gaunt. He's frail. He suffers in so many ways. He wears the plainest garments. He eats very little food, but he has an intensity, this kind of passionate spiritual conviction that is just beyond question, and it's very charismatic. It is very infectious. You might be tempted to compare Bernard of Clairveaux to a televangelist in that he was capable of filling up basically stadiums, massive auditoriums of people who were sitting with rapt attention, listening to his every word. But unlike those guys, he wasn't wearing fancy suits or traveling in a private jet or eating good foods. Bernard subjected himself to levels of physical difficulty and privation that basically no one else was able to keep up with, and even Bernard himself, his own body, wasn't going to be able to keep up with this indefinitely. So this personal credibility, the evidence of the fact that he practiced what he preached, gave him an authenticity and an authority that was unrivaled. People reported that he could do miracles, like healing sick children, that when people gathered en masse to listen to Bernard of Clairveaux, as they did again and again and again over his long lifetime, there are reports that not only did his words have this transporting effect, but his spiritual purity, his righteousness, was powerful enough that he could, in fact, perform miracles of healing as well. And Bernard was actually canonized. He was officially made a saint about 2 decades after his death. So he's now Saint Bernard, by the way, which is, again, a testimony to how highly he was esteemed by the people in his generation. By all accounts, the speech that Bernard of Clairveaux gives at this gathering in France, this royal court in 1146, is an absolute barn burner. And you're going to see, because the effects are dramatic and astonishing. It's really hard to get accurate reports of exactly what somebody said 9 centuries ago. And this is because no one was recording it, and usually you didn't have a scribe sitting down there taking exact dictation of a public speech. So we don't have any authoritative exact quotes of what Bernard said. The best we have are people's reports of what they heard and the effect it had on them. But when people are talking about what they heard, it's kind of like a game of telephone, you know? The farther away you are from the events you're remembering, and the more the accounts have been repeated and passed on from person to person, they tend to change over time. And so we don't have any assurance that any account of what he said is strictly accurate in the way you'd expect from a quote or a transcript. I have found one account of Bernard's speech, which purports to tell us what he said to this gathering. But given the problems that there are around recording that I've just discussed with you, I think it's best to view it as sort of an artist's impression of what Bernard might have said. It is generally consistent with the tone that we have from his verified writings, which are, actual letters and things he wrote down to people. So it's sort of in the voice of Bernard. It's consistent with something Bernard might have said, but please don't think of it as an exact quote. But I'm going to read it to you to give you sort of a flavor of what it might have been like. And this is not the complete artist's impression of what Bernard said. It's an excerpt or a section. But here we go. O ye who listen to me, hasten then to appease the anger of heaven, but no longer implore his goodness by vain complaints. Clothe not yourselves in sackcloth, but cover yourselves with your impenetrable buckler, the din of arms, the dangers, the labors, the fatigues of war, are the penances that God now imposes on you. Hasten then to expiate your sins by victories over the infidels, and let the deliverance of holy places be the reward of your repentance. If it were announced to you that the enemy had invaded your cities, your castles, your lands, had ravished your wives and your daughters, and profaned your temples, who among you would not fly to arms? Well then, all these calamities, and calamities still greater, have fallen upon your brethren, upon the family of Jesus Christ, which is yours. Why do you hesitate to repair so many evils, to revenge so many outrages? Will you allow the infidels to contemplate in peace the ravages they have committed on Christian people? Remember that their triumph will be a subject for grief to all ages, and an eternal opprobrium upon the generation that has endured it. Yes, the living God has charged me to announce to you that he will punish them who shall not have defended him against his enemies. Now, this is consistent with the views that Bernard has expressed in his writing, his views about the idea of crusade as a holy war, as a violence that is justified, and not only justified, but actually incumbent upon people, a kind of religious duty, the sort of violence that will cleanse your soul. And speaking of Muslim forces in the Near East as the infidels, or sometimes, as he's known to have done in his writings, as the children of Satan, for Bernard, this is a spiritual conflict of light against darkness and good and evil. It's a very black and white, simple kind of a proposition, and you're either with him or you're against him, by which he means you're with God or you're not. Like Pope Urban before him, who had preached the First Crusade some 50 years before, Bernard is appealing to the piety of his audience. He's painting an awful picture of the sufferings of Christians in the Near East. And just like the call for the First Crusade, he's promising them spiritual cleansing. He's promising them heaven if they will take up this call and go to arms in the service of the Second Crusade. By the end of his address, we do know that King Louis himself was in tears, and he dramatically rises from his chair and prostrates himself in front of this frail, gaunt, fiery abbot, Bernard of Clairveaux, and he, in front of all of his nobles, takes the Crusader cross. He makes this public oath that he's going to answer the call. He's going to fulfill his religious duty. He's going to the Holy Land. Now, this is the first time that a king, a crowned king, is going to personally lead a crusade. If you remember anything from our talk about the First Crusade, you'll know that there were dukes and nobles, high-ranking aristocrats who went on crusade, but not an actual king. So this is already something new. But what happens next is even more remarkable. Eleanor the Queen then rises and publicly kneels in front of Bernard of Clairveaux, and she also wants to take the cross and make the oath that she's going on this armed pilgrimage, which is the Second Crusade. This is a whole nother thing. So the First Crusade had a very specific kind of direction, that the only people that the Pope wanted going on this were people who were going to be able to bear arms on a battlefield. And while there was this kind of mass popular movement of peasants in which men, women, priests, children, and old people went off as sort of a motley rabble, these weren't people who were informed by the actual directions, the times, the details, and the logistics that were coming through the Pope to organize the First Crusade. So yes, there were women who went, largely as part of the People's Crusade, and there were some women who went with the main body, but they were definitely a minority and they were discouraged. Here, in this moment, you have the highest ranking woman in France, the crowned Queen of France, who's making this public oath to take the cross and to go on this crusade with her husband. So that automatically changes the parameters of the mission, and it opens the door for many other women, noble women, to do the same. So in the wake of this dramatic performance by the king and the queen, many other nobles who are sitting in this assembly also begin to rise, and they are heading toward Bernard. They want to kneel, they want to take the cross, they want to make the oath and declare that they're going on crusade. So there's this large wave of enthusiasm that ensues. And one account says that Eleanor actually slips away at this point and reemerges shortly thereafter with a bunch of women riding on white horses wearing metal armor. So this is dramatic, and it's obviously stage managed. I mean, she must have planned this in advance and set it up. But here she is, now back on the scene in public on a white warhorse in armor, and she's dressed as Penthesilea, who is the leader of the Amazon war party in Greek legend, and the other women with her are dressed as her Amazon warriors. So there's this very Xena warrior princess kind of moment here in the 1100s as the Queen of France and some of these noble women are now suited up in armor and they're ready to ride off and charge the infidel. So there's a little bit of theater going on here as well. So obviously this sort of stunt had been pre-planned to increase the hype, and it absolutely works. Apparently people in this gathering go into an absolute frenzy, and so many of them are now coming forward to take the cross. Not just noble men, but also their wives, and even commoners, even other people, servants and other people who are here, are overwhelmed by this wave of devotion and this urgent call. And so they're lining up, and to take the cross usually meant to literally take strips of cloth and sew them in the shape of a cross on your garment. And that was the public statement that you were now a crusader and you'd taken the oath. So people are doing this and they run out of fabric. So Bernard of Clairveaux himself is forced to take his white woolen robe and give some of it to be torn into strips for these eager people to sew the strips onto their fabric to signify that they've taken the oath. So obviously this meeting in 1146 is a huge success. Bernard of Clairveaux has had an overwhelming effect, and the King and Queen of France and their entire court are all in. They are going on the Second Crusade. But Bernard of Clairvaux's powers of persuasion were so strong that they are going to work even without the stage management of the king's tears and the queen's armor-clad, white horse-riding Amazons. And we're going to see what an effect they have, stripped of all of that stage management, in just a moment. Bernard uses his network of Cistercian monasteries, which have been multiplying at an amazing rate over his lifetime, and he uses them as sort of mouthpieces, organizations that can pick up this call and magnify the message. So he sends the message out through this network of monasteries, and it's carried to local communities in the mouths of monks and priests and churchmen. It's going across Western Europe, all over France, all the way into what we now call the Netherlands. It's going north and south and east. It's going into the lands we would now call Germany, which at the time were part of what they called the Holy Roman Empire, which was ruled by the Holy Roman Emperor, a guy who came from what is now Germany, Swabia, basically. Bernard writes to Pope Eugenius. He's reporting back on the success of carrying the call to the Second Crusade. And he writes to Pope Eugenius that it's been really quite a success. And he says, quote, "You ordered, I obeyed. I opened my mouth. I spoke. And at once the Crusaders have multiplied to infinity. Villages and towns are now deserted. You will scarcely find a man to 7 women. Everywhere you can see widows whose husbands are still alive." Unquote. I think about that for a moment. I mean, it's quite an amazing quote. He's first of all saying that communities have been emptied of men. If there's 1 man left for 7 women, that is a drastic emptying of communities, that people are now on the road, they're making their way across Europe, they're answering this call. But when he says, everywhere you see widows whose husbands are still alive, you have to realize that Bernard knows a lot of these men are never going to come back. That must be a realization that he's completely aware of, even if the men in these communities are not. But he knows that from this massive mobilization of manpower, there's only going to be a fraction of them that return home. And by the way, this prediction is going to turn out to be entirely accurate. Spoiler alert, but that's not today's story. So Bernard's call has been incredibly effective, not just in royal courts, but in everyday communities across Europe. But there's one major holdout, and that is the Holy Roman Emperor himself. Now, he's a very important monarch in Europe. And the power of the Holy Roman Emperor and his army is kind of legendary. The popes have been relying on it for centuries. These Germanic fighters, these Eastern Franks at various points who come down to the north. And the Holy Roman Emperor himself is not perhaps a Frank anymore, but this region that we now call Germany has been fielding very effective armies for a very long time. The Pope wants these guys on the Second Crusade. And while there's some support for it in everyday hamlets and villages throughout the Rhineland, the emperor himself is not enthusiastic. He hasn't expressed any interest in answering this call. Now, just a word to avoid confusion. The Holy Roman Emperor in what is now Germany is not to be confused with the Emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire, sometimes called the Byzantine Emperor, who showed up in our First Crusade story and who's going to show up very soon in the story of the Second Crusade. So in the Middle Ages, there are two emperors. There's the Emperor of the East, Eastern Rome, Byzantine Empire, who sits in Constantinople, what is now Turkey. And there's the Holy Roman Emperor, who you can think of as very Germanic, and he is in the West. And that is the one that Bernard of Clairveaux needs to convince. Conrad, the Holy Roman Emperor, at this time was not likely to be a fan of the Crusade for a number of reasons. First, he'd had his difficulties with the Pope. So just the fact that the Pope was now preaching this crusade wasn't necessarily going to be a strong motivation for him. And also, going on a military expedition under the leadership of the King of France, someone he regarded as a rival and possibly as an inferior, was also not something that was going to fill him with enthusiasm. But if there's anyone who can achieve the miracle of getting Konrad Hohenstaufen, the Holy Roman Emperor, to sign on to this, it is Bernard of Clairvaux. So he's closing in on his target. He's journeying in person to the emperor's lands. He's trying to get an audience. He's circling around the emperor's court. He's trying to close in on his quarry, and the emperor is dodging him. He knows who Bernard of Clairvaux is, he knows what Bernard wants, and he's deliberately avoiding an audience. He's trying to keep this guy at bay. This dance continues until just after Christmas of 1146. So we're now looking at a full year, actually nearly 2 years, since the original call from Jerusalem came, because the call from Jerusalem comes in early 1145. We're now at Christmas at the end of 1146. And it's just after Christmas, on December 27th, that Bernard of Clairvaux is allowed to celebrate Mass with the imperial court. So he joins with them in this religious service, the emperor is present, and then Bernard does something really unpredictable. They're in the middle of Mass, right? It's a regular religious service. It has standard rituals and responses and things that are said. And suddenly in the middle of this, Bernard turns directly to the emperor and he says, "You need to think about giving an account for how you are undertaking your responsibilities in the court of heaven. What are you going to say to God when he asks you, why did you stay home when the rest of Europe answered the call and went to the defense of the holy places and their Christian brethren in Jerusalem? How are you going to explain that to God?" Basically, words along these lines. It's a personal attack. He's saying you need to give an account for how you undertake your duties as king. And remember, this is public. Everybody's there. This is in front of Conrad's nobles, his vassals, the high-ranking aristocrats of the Holy Roman Emperor. And in some ways, this is kind of an attack on legitimacy, right? Because if you're not doing your duty, your spiritual duty as a ruler, then in some ways that makes you a bad ruler, possibly even unfit for the title. So this is a very risky thing that Bernard is doing here. And what happens is that the emperor, possibly sensing the mood in the room, maybe knowing what he knows about how his nobles and other districts in his domain have been responding to this call, perhaps he reads the room and he decides that he's going to submit. And so he answers the call and he says, I'm going to put myself and my army in the service of this. I'm going to undertake this crusade. And there's a meeting shortly thereafter where the frenzy for this call is absolutely overwhelming. The audience of nobles goes wild with enthusiasm. Church bells are rung. People are singing hymns. They're calling out, God wills it. And at one point, the emperor is actually concerned that the frail, sick, very deeply sick little Bernard of Clairveaux is going to be overwhelmed by the press of enthusiastic people and the heat in the room. And he actually wraps Bernard up in his own cloak and carries him out of the church. So now we not only have a king, Louis VII of France, we also have the Holy Roman Emperor committed. The Second Crusade is well and truly on its way. I hope you've enjoyed this episode on the Second Crusade and Eleanor of Aquitaine. And if you did, make sure you're subscribed because the next episode in this series is going to get into the nitty-gritty of the Second Crusade itself. And there's a whole lot of disaster, fighting, misadventure, and scandal in that story. Also, for those of you who are supporting the podcast on Patreon, there's a very special bonus episode coming quite soon on the lecherous, notorious, scandalous William IX, the Duke of Aquitaine, Eleanor of Aquitaine's grandfather. So if you're interested in content like that, please become a supporter of the podcast at patreon.com/Eva Schubert. And stay tuned because there's a lot more history coming soon. I hope I'll see you in the next episode.